Massimo, it's good to see you again.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Um, Welcome to our audience, the Sophia Watchers, Meaning of Life TV, part of the Blogging Heads TV network. And I'm once again here with my partner in crime, Massimo Pigliucci. Massimo, want to do your introduction, and I'll do mine, and we can get started.
Sounds good. I'm Massimo Pigliucci. I'm the KD Rani Professor of Philosophy at City College in New York City.
And I am Professor Daniel Kaufman. I teach philosophy at Missouri State University. So, Massimo, today we are going to talk about a topic that is of great interest to both of us, and I think will be of interest to the audience, and that is um, on some of the core ways in which the social sciences differ from the natural sciences.
Yeah.
And uh, so I thought maybe we'd start off. And I wrote an essay about this recently. It's been something that's been on my mind a lot. It's a topic of interest of mine. I'll link to the essay, obviously, in the link section.
Right. Yeah, I read it. It was well done. I have a number of points of disagreement, but that's
Right.
the idea.
And it was it was a first stab. It was very much not anyway a completed set of thoughts, and I've been thinking about it a lot since then and doing a lot of reading. So I thought we'd start off though with maybe you, given we're very fortunate that you have both a natural science background and a philosophy background, and you're really the ideal person to talk to about this. Um, I would love it if you would give me your understanding of what we mean by explanations in the physical sciences. So when we say that we engage in the physical sciences to find the explanations, to give explanations of various phenomena, what do we mean when we talk about explanations in the physical sciences?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the physical sciences as opposed to the natural sciences, which of course is, in my mind at least, is broader, because I do think there is a distinction to be made up to a point between the actual physical science, meaning mostly physics, chemistry, and geology probably, on the one hand, and biology on the other hand. Biology
So
is, of course, one of the natural sciences, but I do think there's an important distinction to be made there because I think biology is the bridge basically between the natural science and the physical sciences on the one hand and the social sciences on the other hand.
okay, that's good, and may also maybe highlight some disagreements between us.
Sure.
Although I do realize that there are special issues in biology that don't have come up in physics. I am more inclined to be somewhat separate the social sciences from all the rest. And so go ahead and talk about the physical sciences for now, and then
So in physical science, so it used to be before quantum mechanics. Let's bracket quantum mechanics for a minute, right? But before quantum mechanics, it used to be that throughout the scientific revolution and into the early modern times. So we're talking about from Galileo and then Newton up until essentially Einstein and Bohr. In physics, in the physical sciences, in the natural sciences, explanation was based on a causal understanding of what was going on. So, it's either a body hitting another body or a body transferring, heat from one place to another, or a chemical reaction, or, it was a mechanical view of the universe, right? Now that, of course, changed to to some extent, I think changed partially with the advent of quantum mechanics. Because, of course, in quantum mechanics, even though theoretically you can still talk about causes, and some people, some fundamental physicists do talk about causes, really the concept of cause doesn't seem to be making having that much of a sort of fundamental role in quantum mechanics, because stuff just happens, right? So there's a fundamental randomness to what's going on in quantum mechanics. And I don't mean to say that, I do realize that quantum mechanical equations are deterministic. So I'm not using the word randomness in that sense. But it is true that in quantum mechanics is essentially a description of the universe in terms of things just happening. When an atom decays, for instance, the time of decay is entirely random. There is nothing different about the atom as far as we can tell in the moment right before it's going to decay, and as opposed to 1,000 years before that point. The rate of decay is deterministic. We can tell exactly, with a very high degree of precision, what is the likelihood that at any particular moment that a particular atom is going to decay, but we cannot tell when that's actually a specific atom is going to decay. So quantum mechanics has a little changed. It has changed the rule a little bit. The rules a little bit. It's a much more less mechanistic view, and also then, of course, as you know, in quantum mechanics, then immediately we start getting into these different interpretations, which to me means we're doing philosophy and metaphysics more than actual physics. What does it mean to have, the collapse of the wave function? Well, it's not clear. I mean, the mathematics is pretty obvious, but what that means in terms of sort of physics is not clear at all. I don't think that quantum mechanics at the moment is really in the business of giving mechanistic understandings of things. So causality, I don't want to say that causality went out the window with quantum mechanics. It certainly didn't. But it really is looked at in a different way now, even in fundamental physics.
So let me just ask you before you go on, to generalize from what you just said, prior to quantum mechanics, would you say that roughly speaking, what we meant in the physical sciences by an explanation of some phenomena was to offer some sort of antecedent event which is in some sense sufficient for the phenomena that follows? Is that what you're saying? And that's no longer the case in the case of quantum mechanics.
That's right. Strictly no longer the case, because really in quantum mechanics you talk about equations and you talk about laws of nature, but you don't talk about specific causality in specific events. Now, of course, the concept of law of nature has been around far earlier than quantum mechanics. So one could also say that the older mechanistic physics was based on explanations that derive their power from the idea of laws of nature. But to some extent, that to me, as a philosopher especially, kind of begs the question, because to say that things happen because the laws of nature are such, it's only shifting the explanatory level one more level, because one could say, well, yeah, and why are the laws of physics, the laws of nature that way? I mean, what does that mean to have a law of nature? There's been a lot of discussion over the last 2 or 3 decades in philosophy about what do scientists actually mean when they talk about laws of nature.
Right.
On the one hand, it sometimes, actually often, it sounds like they really are thinking about laws, as in, there's some reason out there why things are always in a certain way.
Right.
But on the other hand, a much more reasonable understanding that several philosophers have developed and a number of physicists have agreed on is the idea that just laws of physics is simply generalization. There's just empirical generalizations. They may be exceptionless. Maybe we don't really know, because we don't have access to all quarters of the universe, and nor do we have access to all times in the universe. But nonetheless, I think that the safest thing is to say that laws of nature themselves are the result of certain kinds of interactions between physical stuff. Which means that in fact laws of nature themselves are based on the idea of causality.
Right. So laws of nature are just widely generalizable.
Yeah, that's right.
Causal relations is what they essentially are, right? They take the form of A's cause B's, right? So are you saying though that? Let me ask you this. This is a serious point. Are you saying that because of quantum mechanics, at this point, we can't really give a general account of what an explanation in the physical sciences consists of?
Yeah, that may very well be. And in fact, it's not even just quantum mechanics. If you start going from physics then to biology.
Okay, so maybe talk about biology now. Bring that into the picture.
Right. So you immediately realize that even though biologists themselves often talk about in terms of causality, in fact, all of the so-called special sciences, which, as you know, are every science other than fundamental physics. Or at least every natural science.
Which is, I've never heard of this. I think it's defined different ways, because special sciences, when I was in school, were always were the social sciences, right. The ones that you have trouble reducing, right?
Exactly.
But I've heard
as it turns out, I'm thinking about Jerry Fodor's famous paper back in the 70s that we probably should link to. About the special sciences.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. They are thought of in terms of reducibility. As it turns out, not only you cannot reduce, by that I mean theoretically reduce, giving it an explanation of one in terms of theory of the other. You cannot reduce the social sciences to physics. You cannot reduce biology to physics. In fact, a number of philosophers have argued that you cannot even reduce chemistry to physics, even though that's supposed to be the textbook example of theoretical reduction. So now, just to be clear, I know you know this, but since we always get into trouble when we talk about these things, or at least I get into trouble when I talk about reduction, let me be clear. I am not talking about ontological reduction, meaning that I'm not talking about the fact that I think that somehow living organisms are made of anything other than quarks or strings or whatever it is. Of course they are.
Right.
I'm talking about theoretical reduction, which means we're talking about understanding, human understanding. I am saying that quantum mechanics cannot, even in principle, really be used to explain biological phenomena, because the damn biological phenomena are too damn complicated. And even if you tried, even if somebody did know how to use quantum mechanics, it would be hopelessly complicated for a human mind to understand. So no, there isn't going to be any theoretical reduction of biology to fundamental physics. That's what I mean. I don't mean that somehow biological organisms are magical and they don't they don't obey the laws of physics.
Right. So if quantum mechanics sort of problematizes the idea that physical explanations are basically the providing of antecedent events that are sufficient for subsequent events, how does biology problematize that picture of of explanations as antecedent events that are sufficient for subsequent events?
Well, so here's one way to put it. I mean, there's a number of ways to approach the problem, but one way to put it is this: as you know, with Galileo and Newton, sort of one of the four fundamental Aristotelian causes went out of the window. The final cause.
Right? Yeah, purpose.
So science, purpose. So science started with the scientific revolution of the 16th century and beyond. Essentially, the question of what is this thing for went out of the practice of science. And by the practice of science, really, I should say the practice of physics, because it was mostly physics and to some extent chemistry. That Boyle and people like that. Right. Now then comes 1859, Darwin, and all of a sudden, what are things for? It's back into the picture. Because, Darwin and every biologist since have actually talked very clearly and very explicitly about, well, the eyes are for seeing, the hands are for doing something, manipulating things, and so on and so forth. The heart is for pumping blood, etc., etc. And they don't mean that just metaphorically. They mean that if you go away from that kind of, if you try to stay away from that kind of talk, you have no understanding of what the hell is going on in biology.
Okay, stop there for a minute, because this is really something that you may need to explain. The popular notion is that one of the real accomplishments of Darwin was precisely in showing how the appearance of purpose in nature really isn't purpose in nature. So could you disambiguate the sense in which he is part of the general scientific revolution of rejecting purpose, and in what way purposes are not eliminable?
Okay. So let's make this distinction. This is a great question. Let's make this distinction between teleonomy and teleology. Okay. So teleos, of course, has to do with causes, with final causes. That's the Greek word that Aristotle used. Now, the difference between teleology and teleonomy is precisely that teleology actually is about actual purpose. So if God, let's say, created the universe, then the universe would be a teleological place, meaning that it had the purpose of being, fulfilling whatever God's plans are. Tonight, when I'm going to go out and I'm going to go around, to the Whole Foods around the corner to do my shopping for dinner, that is a teleological process that I'm engaging with, which of course will bring us eventually to the social sciences.
Yes.
Right? Because I have the intention. This is not just a random movement that looks to outsiders as if I had a purpose. I have a purpose. My purpose is to go out there and get me something to eat nice to cook for dinner tonight, right? So God's actions and human actions, and if there are Martians out there, intelligent, conscious Martians' actions are teleological in nature. They display actual purpose. They are the result of actual purpose. Now, the genius of Darwin was to basically create an intermediate category between things that don't have any purpose at all, where the telos simply doesn't apply, and things that are teleological, where the purpose is explicit. It's actually the result of meaning. And that's where teleonomy comes in. So a teleonomic process, like natural selection, in fact, natural selection, as far as I know, it's the only teleonomic process we know of. There may be others out there, but that's the only one that I know of. A teleonomic process gives, as you were putting in a minute ago, the appearance of purpose, right? And so it allows us to recover the Aristotle's final question, what is this thing for? But in a way that excludes the teleology. So when a biologist says, the heart is for pumping blood, it doesn't mean that in a teleological sense. It doesn't mean that the heart was created by some intelligent being in the same way in which the keyboard on my computer is created by an intelligent being for the purpose of me to be able to type stuff. But Darwin does mean that the heart has a function. It's not there. It's not just an assemblage of things. It's not a stone. It's not a.
It has a role relative to a system. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It has a functional role within a system, and we cannot make sense of it unless you actually take on board this idea that there is a function and role. Everything else in outside of biology doesn't, and social sciences doesn't have a function. It's not like atoms don't have functions.
Right.
Planets don't have functions.
They can be viewed that way, but then that is purely the appearance of purpose. We could view physical phenomena as purposeful, but that really is just the appearance of purpose. Whereas with biological phenomena, it's not just an appearance. They do have a role relative to a system, and that is not eliminable in understanding what they are. Correct. But that role is not the result of someone making it on purpose to have that role. Right.
Precisely. So in fact, at this point, ever since Galileo and friends, it really makes no sense to apply the category of purpose to physical objects. It doesn't add anything to our understanding of it. It's not like you could say, oh, well, the purpose of the Earth is to rotate around the sun. That makes no sense from a modern perspective. This is something that maybe 2,000 years ago somebody might have said, but today it makes no sense. Try, however, to get away from the language of purpose in biology, and you lost biology.
So the point is, you cannot have a purely mechanistic biological account.
Correct.
Okay.
Even though, again, I'm not talking about any magic going on here.
But there are a lot of mechanistic accounts in biology, right? It's just not that they can all be given, right? It's because certainly if you think about physiology, right? All our physiological counts are, roughly speaking, mechanistic, right? So if I want to explain, why did this person's hand go up, right? I'm going to give it an account in terms of a series of antecedent events, physiological events that made the hand go up. And so I think here's the question. I mean, whether or not the sort of the line I'm going to run is sustainable depends upon this idea of explanation as seeking antecedent events that are sufficient for subsequent events. Do you think it's still fair, even with all the caveats that we've just introduced, to say that what explanation in the natural science largely consists of are these sorts of efforts to explain subsequent events by pointing to antecedent events that are sufficient for them? Or do you think it's not even fair to say that in a general understanding there's qualifications, understanding there's complications, understanding that at the fringes of science there's all sorts of weirdness? Do you think that that's still a roughly fair way to categorize explanation in the natural sciences now, I'm saying?
Okay, so I would say that it is fair up until the development, the evolution of sort of conscious beings capable of meaningful actions. Okay, I think I'm going to draw a line there.
That's where I would say that after that, what you're really engaged in is social scientific explanation, which I think is of a fundamentally different kind.
Well, let's have a discussion in a minute about whether that's a fundamentally different kind. I don't think it's a fundamentally different kind. I think, however, that there is a significant, there's a major difference there. I don't think it's any different, if you will, So the transition between the biological sciences and the social sciences, to me, looks a lot like the transition between physical chemistry on the one hand and biology on the other. So,
Okay.
right? So the way I see it, obviously biological systems are physical systems. They're physical chemical systems. They're made of molecules and atoms, and those molecules and atoms follow the laws of physics and chemistry. There is nothing, again, magical there. And yet, some of these systems that are made of atoms and molecules are alive, and others are not. Right? And now we're not going to get into discussion of what is the definition of life and all that.
No, I
but
don't think it's necessary.
right.
Yeah.
To me, life is like porn. You get recognized if you see it. And right, and so there.
You said that, not me.
And I stand behind it. So I mean, regardless of the likely intermediate cases, there may be cases where we might not be able to tell exactly, et cetera, but nonetheless, you are alive, and my computer is not, and certainly the rock outside of my door is not alive, and yet they're all made of the same stuff. Okay, so it's the way that stuff is organized that makes something alive or not alive. So in the same way in which I see biological systems fundamentally as physical-chemical systems, and yet they require additional explanations, additional layers of explanations, because otherwise you don't get biology. You just get physical chemistry, and you cannot make sense of a lot of biological processes. Similarly, at the other end of the complexity scale, I think that human beings, of course, are biological organisms. They are biological objects, and therefore they're also physical objects. So we are subjected to all the laws of physics and chemistry, and we are subjected to biological explanations. And yet, those by themselves are not enough to account for human phenomena. You're not going to have a reduction of the social sciences to biology, but that doesn't mean, in my mind, that biology is irrelevant to explanation in the social sciences, just like you're not going to have a reduction of biology to physics and chemistry, but that doesn't mean that physics and chemistry are irrelevant to understanding biology.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, and I understand the way that you see this as a matter of degrees of complexity rather than of category differences.
Right.
And now that you're saying this, I'm getting clear. I think I still am going to want to claim that they're a matter of category differences. And so maybe we'll switch around and I'll throw out something about what I see as a sort of a categorical difference, and then you can sort of respond to it. So to me, what I'm doing when I give a physiological explanation of a series of motor movements, okay, is a fundamentally different sort of thing as what I do as a sociologist or a psychologist in explaining why people engage in abuse.
Yeah. Okay.
And the reason for that is that the intentions that would be invoked as the causes of the abuse and the abuse itself, neither of those are what we would call natural kinds, right? These are, in a sense, what these are motor movements under certain descriptions.
Yeah.
And those descriptions are, to a great degree, normative, okay? And so the motor movements that might be deemed abuse in New York might not be deemed abuse in Pakistan.
Sure.
Okay. And so a motor movement, however, is a motor movement in Pakistan or a motor movement. In other words, a motor movement, to describe something that is a motor movement, is to describe it topic neutrally, right? Is to give it a sort of topic neutral description. Yep. Whereas to describe something as abuse is a highly socially, culturally, and morally inflected description.
Sure.
And so I don't see how the explanation of that could be anything like the explanation of what we give for a motor movement. And secondly, what we do when we engage in these sort of explanation is as much what I would call interpretive as it is explanatory in the sense meant by in this sense that we've been talking about, that we agree is full of exceptions and everything. Right. If I want to explain why the arm moves, I give a set of physiological causes, and those are going to be true whether it's in New York or it's in Pakistan. But if I'm going to talk about why people engage in child abuse, let's say, um, um, as much of what I'm doing is as much explaining, talking about why we count this as abuse over here.
Sure.
And notice if we have a disagreement, say, the Pakistani also ought to view it as abuse. That's a moral disagreement, not a scientific one.
Right.
So this is why I think this is the base reason. Now we can get into more detail, but this is why I think the difference in what we're doing in explanations in the physical sciences and what we're doing in the social science is of a categorical difference, not simply a matter of increasing complexity.
Right. So a couple of comments. First of all, this past semester at City College, I taught a course on epistemology across the curriculum. It was called The Unity of Knowledge. And so I had a number of colleagues from different disciplines, from the humanistic ones to the social science to the natural sciences, coming in and giving talks about what they were doing. And one of them in particular struck me as interesting. And the talk was about colonialism, right? And my colleague who introduced the topic of colonialism said, "Look, I consider myself a social scientist. I consider myself somebody who studies, the sociology of certain movements, the history from a sociological perspective of certain occurrences." And he drew my students' attention to the word social science, right? He said, "Well, why do we call it a science? Other than because there's a cachet these days about being associated with the sciences, so you get more money because of that." But he said, there is an interesting reason why it's called a science, he said, and then there's also an interesting reason why we use the word modifier social. He said, if I want to understand colonialism, I do need to bring in quote unquote scientific facts, such as an understanding of, let's say, resources available to people and societies, an understanding of the mechanics of certain things going on, including weaponry and so on and so forth. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of quantitative stuff that a scientific approach to the study of colonialism can give me. But he said, if that were all, I wouldn't understand colonialism. What it's missing still is the understanding from a human perspective, from the point of view of a human narrative. Why is it that certain people do certain things under certain circumstances? What goes on in their mind? What are they, and not only in the mind of the colonialists, but in the mind of the colonized, and so on and so forth. And so he said that in his opinion, what he was doing is social science in the sense that it was melding these two perspectives. On the one hand, he needed the scientific approach to things, the quantification, the reliable data, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, he needed understanding that it's possible only once you bring in human teleology. I would say he didn't use that word, but I would say human teleology, so meaning, right? So keep that in mind for a second. Now the second thing that came to mind when you were talking about a particular action, being acceptable ethically in one society and not acceptable in the other society, even though the action from a physiological perspective is exactly the same. Well, there is a parallel there in biology. I mean, when we say that something, that certain physiologies or certain structures are adaptive, right? So let's say the ability of a leaf to capture light in a certain way or something like that. It's always understood that phrase is within a particular context. There's nothing that is adaptive no matter what. It's always a dependence of the environment in which you live. So a particular leaf structure is adaptive in one environment, but if the plant starts living in a different environment, that thing is actually not going to work. It's not adaptive. And even though the physiology is exactly the same, the molecular biology and molecular structure is exactly the same, you change the context, and all of a sudden that leaf is not going to work, or it's going to work in a very different way. So if you put those two things together, look, I understand, and in fact, I'm going to agree with you that certain, you put my original description of things in the way of a continuum. But continua are not necessarily monotonic, and they're not necessarily sort of graded, right? You can have a continuum that has sort of certain variation and then a very sharp uptick of some variable or some whatever it is that describes the system. And so it looks like the two systems now, the system before and after the transition, is completely different. It's qualitatively different, while in fact it is not. There is an underlying sort of quantitative transition. That's the way I see the transition between non-living and living, and the transition between non-social and social, or non-meaningful and meaningful. That is, yeah, they look very different. And those differences are quantitatively large enough that if you want to talk about them being qualitative, I'm on board. I'm okay. What I'm not okay with is to say, therefore, there's an entire category of explanation that now all of a sudden becomes irrelevant. I still think it is relevant. It's just insufficient at this point.
Okay, this is very interesting, and it may be bordering on a very academic discussion that maybe this is a risk we'll have to take. There's very smart people in the audience.
Why not?
The thing about adaptiveness is a very good point, because what it shows is that some of the key concepts in biology can only be ascribed contextually, right? And so that strikes me as a reason why you're never going to get laws of biology like you'd get laws of physics, right? Because they're simply not going to admit of the kind of generalization that we typically think of when we think of a physical law, right?
Right.
But it seems to me that the question of whether something is ascribable only contextually is a separate question of whether something is only ascribable under an interpretation, okay? That strikes me as different, and that's where I see the category differences happening, right? Is that in the social sciences, when we give explanations, and I'm putting it in scare quotes because I'm not sure I think they are explanations, given how we've understood them, both the alleged cause and the alleged effect are described via terms that can only be ascribed under an interpretation, right? Right. So let me give you an example. So let's keep with the example of abuse, just to keep it simple and not fly all over the place. So,
Okay.
There's been a number of, this is a very hot topic now. This is on everybody's mind. I would say it's a bit obsessive right now. The whole child abuse phenomenon. Okay. You have a lot of sort of breathless scientific announcements. We found something in the brain, right? So all the child molesters have some sort of brain, there's something about their brain, right? So that is an attempt to give a physiological explanation, to give a physiological cause for this behavior. And what I think about this is that such an explanation is completely irrelevant. It does not help you understand anything, because of course the brain of the Pakistani is no different from the brain of the person in New York, okay? And the Pakistani, I'm using, please don't, I don't want to have like a deluge of Pakistanis like saying we're not a bunch of child abusers. So let me just invent a fake country, okay? Country X, right? In which child brides are common and are integrated into the culture and part of the religion and all this sort of stuff, okay?
Right.
For first of all, the phenomenon wouldn't even be a subject of social scientific investigation in that society, because it's not viewed as a pathology. It's not viewed as socially dysfunctional. It's simply not interpreted in such a way that it would raise social scientific interest. That's number one. Number two, it seems to me that the explanation that would be useful for why if we were asking in the United States, well, why is there all this why do people engage in child abuse? We're going to refer to various kinds of socially and inflected descriptions of people's mental states, right? So we're going to say things like, well, it's a result often of people who have failed to develop correct boundaries, right? It's the result of people who have had, let's say, dysfunctional families in various ways, and so on and so forth. But notice, all of those are not themselves topic-neutral descriptions of states of mind. They are themselves interpretive, normative descriptions. And so it seems to me that those are the kind of explanations that are really useful, right? And what it not pointing to people's brains. And what that reveals is that what we're not really trying to give a series of antecedent events that are sufficient to explain a subsequent event. What we're really trying to do is explore, why do we interpret these sorts of behaviors as dysfunctional in this way in our society, right? And what are the relevant sort of social, contextual, personal, familial relations that give rise to them, right? In which we find them, right? But that strikes me as an entirely different enterprise from explaining why someone's arm goes up.
Okay, yes and no. So, couple of points. First of all, notice that even you a minute ago used the term sort of causal explanations. Now, the fact that we use the word causal as a modifier of explanation, to me, suggests that there are some explanations that are non-causal.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough.
And in fact, I gave you right at the beginning some examples in physics of explanations that are non-causal.
Yeah, right.
So why did the particular atom decay? Well, because the laws of quantum mechanics says that it has to decay, but there was no cause in the sense of a specific antecedent to that specific event, right? So one suggestion that I'm going to put forth is that, yes, you're right, human motivations, human cultural context, human ethics, and so on and so forth are all part of the explanation of certain behaviors. And in fact, they may even be the most relevant part of that explanation. But nonetheless, they're not the entire explanation. So let me give you an example. Now, that gives me to the second point I wanted to bring up. So you said, if the guy is engaging in certain kind of behavior, pedophilia or whatever it is, the brain is the same. Well, yes, and to a broad extent that's true. And the brain, of course, is the kind of thing that precisely it's the kind of organ that allows us to react differently to different external conditions and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, there are also interesting cases where you literally can say, or can arrive pretty close to the, what sounds almost like a joke, my brain made me do it. Well, of course your brain made you do it. Your brain is what, where your causal powers, mental powers reside to begin with in interaction with the external world. But there was this case that I think I described in Answers for Aristotle, of this guy in the southern United States, I think it was in Virginia, a few years ago, that all of a sudden starting engaging, feeling very strong sort of attraction to young boys and engaging in pedophilic behavior, essentially. And he got in trouble, and he eventually got caught. I think it wasn't engaging in directly in any behavior, but it was looking at child pornography or something like that, right? And so he got in trouble, got discovered, got in jail. Then, and he kept saying, this is not me. This is, I don't understand why I'm doing this thing all of a sudden. This was a sudden behavior. They discovered that he actually was developing a fairly large tumor in his brain in an area that is actually directly related to sort of the higher cognition, the higher level control of our actions. They removed the brain tumor. The feeling of interest for young boys disappeared. And then it came back a few years later, and sure enough, the tumor had been back. Now, this is a fairly starking case, and I'm not even close to going to suggest that there is going to be that kind of very simple, very mechanistic explanations about all of our behaviors. I don't believe that for a second. In fact, what I think it's interesting is precisely that case is anomalous. It's so clear-cut. It's so obviously outside of the norm that it teaches us something.
Right, because it's very unlikely that in a society in which child marriages are normal, that all the adults are walking around with brain tumors, right?
That's right. No, absolutely. That's not what I was going.
Yeah.
What I was going over was that here we have a case of, if you will, basically the opposite of what you're presenting. You're presenting a situation where we all have similar brains. Now, we don't have the same brain, obviously, but we all have very similar brains. But then the environmental, the cultural environment changes, and those brains make us behave in different ways, right? So in other words, the majority of the explanation the burden of explanation goes into the society, into the cultural milieu, as opposed to the brain, because the brain is essentially constant. What I suggested is a situation, what I presented is a situation where this is exactly the opposite. The cultural context is fixed. The guy didn't move. He didn't live in a different society. The brain changed.
And there was this change of behavior. Yeah.
And so that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that obviously you need both levels of explanation for human behavior in general. I mean, after all, if we didn't have
brains, we wouldn't behave at all, right?
Right. If we didn't have that kind of
brain. This is about explanatory frameworks, and it's not about that. I agree with you. Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. So when I as you know, I'm myself very skeptical about the "my brain made me do it" kind of thing. It's like, oh well, it's the Pleistocene brain that causes us to do certain things. Well, no, the Pleistocene brain allow us to do a certain number of things, because without a brain like this,
you're talking like this sort of like these evil Eve psych sort of these glib sort of. Well, the reason why men sleep around more than women is because of their evolutionary, spread their seed, as opposed to that sort of thing. Yeah.
There's another example that I think is relevant, and it's actually Gord. I'm going to give you a hand in this case, actually, because the example I thought was very interesting, and but it goes into your direction your way of reasoning, and that is this. This is also something that I think I mentioned in Answers for Aristotle. So there was a study about the reaction to alcohol in two different groups that was carried out in Connecticut a number of years ago. And what they did was the researchers noticed that the Irish sort of community, in the Irish community, there was a high degree of sort of drunk behavior, and sort of the typical thing that we associate with drunk behavior, so on and so forth. But they also noticed that in the same area, same town, there was an Italian population which apparently consumed about the same amount of alcohol, and yet was not engaging in those kinds of behaviors. So the question, what the hell is going on there? The alcohol is the same, so the chemistry is the same. The brains are the same, because nobody believes that Italians and Irish have different, enough genes, that their brain structure is completely different. So what the hell is going on there? And there, the explanation really was a question of social science where the social is more important than the science. Meaning that, well, what was going on was that the cultural context in which these two things were happening. The Italians were consuming large quantities of alcohol, but that was within a family environment.
Around the dinner table.
Where a certain kind of behavior was expected. The Irish in that particular population were consuming the same amount of alcohol, but that was at a pub where the purpose was to get wasted.
Yep.
So that it tells you that, yes, in those cases, clearly the answer is not biological, it's not chemistry, it's society, it's intention, it's behavior from a point of view of sort of what happens in one group is very different from what happens in the other group. So I think you're right if you want to claim that not only we wouldn't understand human behavior if we didn't take into account sort of the intentions and the social milieu and so on and so forth, but in fact that it doesn't make any sense to look for explanation of human behavior outside, without taking into account those levels of explanation. Those levels of explanations are very often the most important ones. Just like in biological systems, the adaptation and the natural selection is often the more important level of explanation, and not the physics and chemistry. But the physics and chemistry is what allows natural selection to actually work. It's what constrains the system. And I think it's useful to see human beings in a similar way. That is, the explanations tend to be about intentions in societies and culture and so on and so forth. But of course, all of those are made possible by a particular biology, without which none of that would be actually happening. And occasionally that biology does creeps up in a way that actually directly furnishes a major part of the explanation, as in the case of the pedophiliac, suddenly, on and off pedophiliac with the brain tumor.
Right.
But those are exceptions. I do think that those are exceptions. I don't think that's the norm.
Right. And so, I'm realizing sort of the complicating factors here. I think that my initial idea was that explanations by explanations in the physical sciences, we typically mean causes, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I don't think that what we call explanations in the social sciences typically can be called causes. Um, um,
Well,
the question is whether this is a good way of making this distinction, or
yeah.
whether there's a different way of making the distinction that still captures, because it's not clear from what all that you've said that it's really a good way to characterize explanations of the physical sciences as referring to them as causes.
Right. So remember, causes are good, and they're useful in between the quantum world and the social world.
Yeah.
Everything in between is
or
causes.
even the biological, because the biological accounts are not purely causal either, because there's a teleonomic dimension to them.
Yeah, that's true. But the teleonomic dimension, well, that's an interesting point. But I still think that even in biology, outside again of actual teleology, so outside of actual intentions, even in biology, I think you can give a mechanism. I mean, biologists talk about causes, even at the level of natural selection. I mean, the causes are more complicated than the ones that act at the physical-chemical level, but I still think it's a matter of causes. Now, I noticed that in your essay, you say, well, and of course, I'm not about to give you an account of causality of causes here, but I think that at some point we might have to, because when you say, for instance, that, in physics and chemistry and perhaps in biology, causes are the explanatory level, the explanatory concept, but reasons, let's say, right, are what carries most of the explanation in terms of humans. Well, somebody could say, yeah, but reasons are just a type of cause.
Right, and that's where I said that that's not the case.
But you cannot say that without actually say, well, why not? Why wouldn't you count?
Right.
So I'm actually genuinely curious, why wouldn't you count reasons as causes?
Well, partly because of how I understand a cause, roughly, again, with a million complications, as an antecedent event that's sufficient for a subsequent event, right?
Okay.
And thus, A, you have to have the relation of sufficiency, and B, the things you have to be talking about have to be events, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that the typical categories that we seek to explain in the social sciences are events. I think that they are events under various intentional descriptions. And that therefore that's a very different sort of animal. And it also has so one reason is that I don't think that in social sciences we really are explaining, we're really giving antecedent conditions for various events. Secondly, I don't think that the purpose is the same. In other words, the reason we seek the explanation in the social sciences, and this is what I said in my essay, is that it seems to me that what we're really trying to do in a social scientific explanation is render people's behavior intelligible within a kind of narrative, right? That is, we have, and that narrative is teleological, right? We have a sort of a picture, and we're trying to fit people's behavior into this picture, and it's a picture roughly that renders them reasonable, renders their behavior reasonable in the sense of being intelligible to us as fitting within this picture. I think that that's not the main reason why we seek out explanations in the physical sciences. If anything, the physical sciences more and more are telling us that the universe is not intelligible in this way, it's not reasonable in this way, does not fit into the sort of a teleological narrative. And that's the reason why so many people, for example, aren't satisfied with the scientific picture and add a religious picture on top of it, right? It's precisely because they aren't getting out of. But I do think that in the social sciences, mostly what we're trying to do is understand, is render people's behavior intelligible within a story, right?
Yeah.
Whereas that's not what we're trying to do in the physical sciences.
Well, let me try to parse this for a second. So, because one could argue that actually science in general is in the business of providing intelligibility of whatever the subject matter is within a narrative. Now, a scientist probably wouldn't put it that way.
But not a teleological narrative.
No, not a teleological narrative,
right,
for sure. but there are different kinds of narratives, right? And so now a scientist probably wouldn't put it this way, but as a philosopher, I would say, look, scientific theories are not out there. They're human constructions.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's true that physicists often talk about the theory of everything as if it were out there to discover, but we forget that what's out there to discover is the physical world. When we present a theory is a human creation. It's something that is made so that we can make intelligible the behavior of certain bodies or certain phenomena, right? So when Copernicus came up with his theory about the solar system, the point was to make intelligible the movements of the planets.
Right.
Which was not intelligible before. It was difficult to account for. And a scientific theory is a type of narrative. Now, you're right. Of course, it's not a teleological narrative, for sure. But it is a kind of a narrative. It's created by a human being.
Right.
For the purpose of other human beings. Nature doesn't need theories. We need theories. So I would say that the general idea in science, and I'm going to push it to say, as in fact, any science, is in fact understanding in the form of a narrative. Now, that narrative can take different forms. If we're talking about fundamental physics, it will take the form of mathematical equations.
Right.
If we're talking about the special sciences, except for the social ones, it will take the form of cause and effect, so theories based on cause and effect. And if we're talking about social sciences, it will take the form of human intentions. And so we have non-teleological narratives, we have teleonomic narratives, and we have teleological narratives, but they're still narratives in the broader sense of all of this is for the purposes of making sense of what's going on out there for our own little minds.
Right.
And so in that sense, I rather see the social sciences along this continuum being in the business of providing us with understanding under certain levels of descriptions and certain types of description.
Right.
Again, I would agree with you if you say, but those types and levels of descriptions are far removed from physics. Yes, they are. And they're pretty far removed from biology. Yes, they are, again.
I guess, and this is the, like I said, a work in progress. So in a sense, I'm working this through as I'm talking to you about this. Sure. I guess where I see really the sort of the category difference is that it seems to me that maybe what this really at the end of the day is a matter of normativity, right? That is that the narrative that we seek the social scientific explanations to inform is largely a normative narrative, right? I'm thinking of I don't know how familiar you are with Wilfrid Sellars. His distinction between the manifest image and the scientific image. Right. And more I'm starting to think that what this issue is really is that issue, right? The reason I was fiddling around is because I was pulling something up that I deliberately quoted before I got on with that I cut and pasted before I got on with you. Mm-hmm. So Sellars describes the manifest. Here's what he said. Here's how he describes what the manifest image that is the image that what I'm calling the image that the thing that the social sciences are interested in talking about, right? As opposed to what the physical sciences are talking about. He says that talking about it as a narrative, quote, provides the ambience of principles and standards above all those which make meaningful discourse and rationality itself possible, within which we live our own individual lives, right? So in a sense, we live our lives at one level as part of a story. And that story is a story that is a heavily moral story. It's a story that has a moral arc to it. It's a story that, and it's a story whose social, political, economic, and all those other social scientific dimensions are heavily inflected by that moral arc, right? Think about, so many of the things that we're interested in understanding in the social sciences are behaviors that have various moral significance, right, for us. We're interested in mob violence. We're interested in why governments deprive people of liberty. We're interested in predatory lending practices. We're interested in, so many of the things we're interested in these social scientists are things that go directly to the ways in which human motor movements are meaningful, right? And have significance, have a kind of moral, social, political significance. And I just don't see the business of understanding all that as in any way like the business of understanding why people's arms and legs move, right? Why their pupils dilate. And I see that as a category difference, not just as a difference in complexity, because we're talking about an entirely different kind of thing, and we're engaging in the inquiry for a very different kind of purpose, right?
I'm going to certainly grant you it's not the same kind of inquiry as why do pupils dilate? Although, well, forget the pupils. Yeah, I'm going to grant you the pupils.
I only use that because of my example in the essay of voyeurism, right? So a social scientific account of why people are voyeurs is not the same kind of account as the account of why people's pupils dilate, even though voyeurism involves all sorts of pupils dilating, right?
Right. No, that's correct. And now, however, although it's true that the majority argue, or certainly a large chunk of what we're interested in terms of social sciences does have what you call a normative dimension. It has to do with ethics in this construed in broad sense. Yes. Certainly not all human behavior has a normative dimension, right?
No.
I mean, right. So if I am thirsty, if you had to explain why I'm going to get up in a minute, I'm not, but I'm going to get up in a minute.
Drink a glass of water.
Yeah.
But that's not what the social scientists are most. But that's not what the social scientists are mostly interested in explaining.
No, right. but then again, true that they're not interested. But it is a type of human behavior which does have intentions as part of the explanation, right? So and in fact, it's a perfect example for me because it is the kind of behavior. It's a simple behavior, of course. Granted, it's nothing as complicated as a mob, behaving in a certain way, but it is the kind of behavior that shows that, well, yeah, there is a biological component there. I'm thirsty, and I can give you a completely physiological explanation of why I'm thirsty, right? But the fact that I'm getting up at this particular moment and going to the refrigerator and open and getting a beer instead of water, or getting this particular beer instead of another beer, or whatever it is, or beer instead of wine, that has not much to do with being thirsty. It has to do with a lot of social motivations and popular advertisement and customs and so on and so forth.
Right.
Right. So similarly, if I have sex, well, that's because I lust for a particular person. Okay, but why am I lusting for in general? Well, I lust in general because I'm a particular type of biological being that has certain particular types of urges. But the way those urges actually manifest themselves, this person rather than that person, this moment rather than that moment, is greatly influenced by motivations and intentions and cultural background and so on and so forth. So those are behaviors that don't have necessarily intrinsically an ethical dimension to it, a normative dimension, and yet they still involve intentions and they still involve a social aspect to things. And those are easier, I think, to understand than the ones that are normative, because the ones that are normative, you're right, there's an added layer of complication there. But I think that what may the danger may be of jumping straight to the normative behaviors and thinking that it's the normative aspect that is fundamental, while in fact the normative aspect is just one more complication, but it's not what's fundamental to the understanding of the behavior. I'm not trying to knock down the ethics, as you know. I'm very interested in normative things.
Yeah.
But those other examples, I think, in my mind at least, make it clear that there is not necessarily this irrelevance of biological explanation on the one hand, and it is also the case that social explanations not need necessarily to be normative.
Right. And I don't know, I guess I don't know that I want to say that the biological explanations or physiological explanations are always everywhere irrelevant. More what I was trying to say was that it's a very different kind of thing to give a physiological explanation of a series of motor movements than
Yeah.
it is to give a social scientific explanation of an action,
Yeah.
which is a
Agreed.
bodily movements under under an intentional description.
Yeah.
Um, um,
Agreed. But
yeah,
I don't think that's correct. But that distinction I don't think is different in kind from the distinction that I was making earlier between biological and physical systems, right?
right,
So it's true that biological organisms, again, are made of molecules, and so they're subjected to the laws of chemistry, but the laws of chemistry by themselves don't tell me enough. In fact, they tell me rather little about why a plant has a leaf shaped in a particular way. It's molecules, but the reason why those molecules are organized in a particular way is because there's a function, and that function is the result of natural selection, and natural selection is definitely a different kind of explanation from physical chemical explanations.
right.
In fact, it literally cannot be reduced to physical chemical explanation. You don't have a theory, and I don't think you're ever going to have a theory.
Well, there couldn't be one if what
Right.
you're saying is correct, right? I mean,
Right. That's right. I don't think there can be one.
All right, so let me just, we're probably past the point at which I'm well prepared enough to sort of discuss this in a way that's not just going to be rambly and back and going around in circles, because it's too difficult. The subject matter is too difficult. I just want to, one last thing that you didn't yet comment on with respect to what I had said is, and let's just focus narrowly on whether we can treat social scientific explanations as causal, okay?
Okay.
And let's bracket everything else, because that's certainly one of my sort of the core ideas is that I don't think that that social scientific explanations, and really what we're talking about are what we would call folk psychological explanations, because that's ultimately what they all involve, right?
Yes.
Are genuinely causal. Would you agree that a genuinely causal explanation, both the antecedent and the consequent, both the cause and the effect, have to be discrete events?
Gosh, that's certainly a classical interpretation, but discrete events, I don't know. We live in the world of quantum mechanics where there are no discrete events.
But there's no causality either, right? You said
but there's no teleology either.
Right.
So if the goal is to exclude, to sort of set aside the teleology, you don't get the teleology just by doing away with causality. That's one way to look at it. The other one is, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of biologists who argue for simultaneous causality, for causality, for even downward causality, things like that. So that's the problem, that by causality people mean all sorts of different stuff. Right?
Do you think? Let me how about putting it this way? Do you think that? Do you think that? What I want to get at is whether you would describe certain things as events, right? And so clearly, arms and legs moving are events, right?
Yeah. Sure.
Is a riot an event? What I guess I want to say is that a riot is not an event, because a riot isn't simply arms and legs moving. It's arms and legs moving under all sorts of intentional descriptions that I'm sorry.
Be careful, because now you're getting close to begging the question, right? I mean, you're embedding in your definition of event intentionality, and well, if you do that, then yes, of course, we have to agree by definition. The question is, can something intentional be an event? I would say that a riot is an event, or a series of events, if you will.
Right. I guess what I'm getting at, here's what I'm getting at, and maybe it's just too esoteric, but what I'm getting at is, I guess, once you say that something is an interpretation, right? So when I say that a riot, to describe something as a riot is to take a series of motor movements and under a certain interpretation.
Yes.
Well, interpretations involve the following of rules. Interpretation is essentially a form of rule following, and rule following is inherently public. And so, in other words, I guess what I'm saying is, the motor movements are discrete events, but the riot is the discrete events as understood within a community of speakers.
Sure.
But that whole thing is not an event, right?
Okay, let's say that, sure.
And so that's what I want to say. When the social scientist explains that bigger thing, he's
Yeah.
not strictly speaking explaining an event. He's
Right.
as much explaining how we interpret certain events, how a community interprets certain events, as he's explaining events. To explain events would be to explain the motor movements.
Right. Okay.
I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah. Okay. I can follow you there, and I think I can still recover my
Okay, please.
point of view, and that is again by making the analogy with teleonomy instead of teleology, right?
Okay.
So teleonomy being the appearance of purpose in biology. I think that's actually very useful as a sort of contrast category, because if we go straight from purely physical events to social events, I think we're missing the bridge, as I was saying earlier.
Okay.
So let me try to